It was a dark and quiet day in the galaxy when the Elysium, one of the most advanced ships humanity had ever built, vanished without a trace. The ship had been on a mission to explore uncharted space, a mission that promised to expand the boundaries of human knowledge. Captain Jackson Harris, once part of the crew of the Elysium, had been there when it launched. Now, it was a memory, a lost cause. No one knew what happened to the ship or its crew. And for years, the silence surrounding the disappearance had haunted Jackson. The Elysium was a marvel of technology, a vessel designed to push the limits of exploration. Its crew, made up of the best minds from across the galaxy, had been the pride of humanity. Jackson, a young and ambitious officer at the time, had been thrilled to be part of such an important mission. But when the ship failed to report back as scheduled, and every attempt to locate it ended in failure, Jackson's excitement turned into dread. Years passed, and the mystery of the Elysium remained unsolved. It was a wound that never fully healed. For Jackson, it was more than just the loss of a ship. It was the loss of friends, colleagues, and the future they had dreamed of. Some called it a tragic accident. Others whispered about the ship encountering something dangerous. But whatever the truth was, the Elysium was gone, and with it, any hope of understanding what had happened to it. The galaxy had moved on. New missions, new discoveries, and new ships took the place of the Elysium. But Jackson couldn't forget. He often found himself staring out into the vastness of space, wondering where the ship had gone and why it had never returned. Some nights, he swore he could still hear the hum of the engines, the voices of his old crew calling out in the silence of the universe. One day, a message arrived at Jackson's station. It was a signal, faint and distorted, coming from deep in uncharted space. At first, it seemed like another false alarm, just another transmission that would lead nowhere. But there was something about it that made Jackson's heart race. He recognized the pattern, the rhythm. It was a distress signal, but it was more than that. It felt familiar. Jackson knew that the signal was from the Elysium. His instincts told him this was no coincidence. He had to investigate. Even if it meant risking everything, he couldn't ignore it. It was a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. He gathered a small crew, one that he trusted, and set a course for the source of the signal. As their ship sped toward the unknown, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something much bigger than the Elysium's disappearance. Something that could change everything. The Starfinder, Jackson's ship, cut through the darkness of space with its engines humming quietly. It wasn't the biggest ship in the fleet, but it was reliable, just like its captain. Jackson sat in the cockpit, his eyes focused on the star chart. The crew was ready, but even they couldn't hide their unease. They were headed into unknown territory, and there was no telling what awaited them. The signal had come from a part of space no one had dared to explore in years. It wasn't just the distance that made it dangerous. It was the unknown. For decades, the region had been marked as a no-go zone due to strange energy readings and bizarre phenomena. Many believed that nothing good could come from venturing there. Still, when Jackson had heard that familiar pattern in the distress signal, something inside him snapped. He couldn't just ignore it. He had to go. "Captain, we're nearing the coordinates," Lieutenant Maya called from the navigation console. Her voice was steady, but Jackson could hear the uncertainty beneath it. The rest of the crew was equally silent, their eyes fixed on their consoles as the tension in the air thickened. Jackson nodded. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Keep the comms open and keep alert. We don't know what we're walking into." As they neared the source of the signal, Jackson's thoughts raced. He had been haunted by the Elysium's disappearance for years. What if this was a chance to finally bring closure? What if the crew was still out there, waiting for rescue? Or worse, what if they had been lost to something far more terrifying than a mere accident? The signal was still faint, but it was growing clearer as they got closer. It wasn't a regular distress call. Jackson could tell that much. It was almost deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was sending it had been waiting for someone to hear it. "Captain," Maya spoke again, her voice slightly shaky. "We're getting a massive energy reading. Something's out there, and it's huge." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Keep us steady. We're not turning back now." The crew held their breath as the Starfinder entered the strange area of space, and ahead of them, in the distance, a silhouette emerged from the blackness. It was unmistakable. The ship was enormous, dark and silent, its hull covered in layers of cosmic dust. It had to be the Elysium. There was no other explanation. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. The Elysium was real. It wasn't a myth, and it wasn't a figment of his imagination. But what had happened to it? Why had it returned after all these years? And who, or what, was still aboard? "Prepare for docking," Jackson ordered. His voice was calm, but inside, he was fighting a mix of excitement and dread. The crew moved quickly, securing their positions, but no one spoke. The silence was thick, filled with questions that no one had the answers to. As the Starfinder approached the Elysium, a strange chill swept over the ship. It was as if the very air had changed, charged with an energy that none of them could understand. And then, as if on cue, the Elysium's communication system crackled to life, sending a low, eerie tone through the speakers. "Help! Us!" The voice was weak, distant, but unmistakable. It was the Elysium's crew. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. It was a cry for help, but something about it felt wrong. Something had changed. The Starfinder floated silently in the shadow of the Elysium. The enormous ship was as still as the cold, empty space surrounding it, its dark hull looming ominously against the black void. From a distance, it appeared to be abandoned, but Jackson knew better. The message was proof of that. Someone, or something, was still on board. The question was, what had happened to the crew? Where were they? "Captain, we're in position," Maya said, her voice steady but tense as she navigated their ship into the docking bay of the Elysium. The space around them felt heavier now, charged with an unexplainable tension. No one on board the Starfinder had spoken much since they received the signal. The excitement of finding the Elysium had quickly turned into nervous anticipation. Jackson stood up, his eyes never leaving the massive ship ahead. "Everyone, stay sharp. We don't know what we're walking into." He grabbed his blaster from its holster and motioned for his crew to follow him. The Elysium was a ghost ship, abandoned for years, yet somehow still intact. As they made their way into the airlock, Jackson's thoughts raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Ships didn't just disappear and reappear like this. The Elysium had vanished without a trace, and now, here it was, floating as if nothing had ever happened. The airlock doors opened, and a cold gust of stale air greeted them. It felt wrong, like they were stepping into a tomb. The Elysium's once glorious corridors were dimly lit, the lights flickering occasionally, casting long, eerie shadows. Everything was eerily silent. No sounds of engines, no hum of activity. Just the stillness of a ship that seemed to have been frozen in time. "Anyone else feel like we're not alone?" Lieutenant Maya whispered, her hand tightly gripping her weapon. Her eyes darted around the empty hallways as if expecting something to jump out at any moment. "I feel it too," Jackson replied, his voice low. "Stay close. We need to search the ship and find out what happened." As they ventured deeper into the Elysium, the crew moved cautiously, their boots echoing off the metal floors. The ship was vast, and it didn't take long for them to realize that it had been deserted. At least, that's what it seemed. Empty rooms, unused consoles, and abandoned supplies were scattered across the ship. The further they went, the more unsettling it became. They came to the bridge. The door slid open with a hiss, and inside, the console screens were still active, showing maps of star systems Jackson didn't recognize. At the captain's chair sat a figure, slumped over, as if the person had simply been waiting there for something. Jackson rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest, only to stop dead in his tracks. The figure wasn't human. It was tall, with pale skin and glowing eyes, its body covered in strange markings. It was one of the Elysium's crew members, or at least it looked like one. But the face was distorted, the features warped in a way Jackson couldn't comprehend. The creature stirred. Slowly, it turned toward them, and its glowing eyes locked onto Jackson's. It opened its mouth, but instead of speaking, it emitted a low guttural growl. Jackson's hand instinctively went to his blaster, but before he could react, the creature let out a strange, unsettling sound, a shriek. And then, the Elysium came alive. The shriek echoed through the Elysium, and the sound sent a chill down Jackson's spine. It wasn't just the noise itself, it was the way it felt, like a warning, a cry that sent a ripple of fear through the crew. The creature on the bridge, its glowing eyes fixed on Jackson, was no longer a confused figure. It was something else, something dangerous. Jackson's heart raced as he raised his blaster, ready for whatever came next. But before he could act, a series of loud, mechanical sounds rang out from all directions. The Elysium systems, which had been eerily silent, now hummed to life. The lights flickered brightly, and the doors to the bridge slammed shut, trapping Jackson and his crew inside. "What the hell is going on?" Maya shouted, her voice filled with panic. She quickly glanced around, her weapon at the ready. The bridge, once abandoned and cold, now seemed alive with energy, but it wasn't the kind of life they had expected to find. Jackson didn't answer. He was too focused on the creature that was now standing slowly, its movements stiff and unnatural. Its glowing eyes never left Jackson's face as it took a few unsteady steps toward him. It was like the thing was trying to recognize him, or worse, it was calculating how best to attack. Suddenly, the creature opened its mouth again. But this time, it wasn't a scream. It was words. "You came back." Jackson's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea what was happening. The Elysium had returned, but it wasn't the same ship that had left. The crew, were they still human? What had happened to them? The question burned in Jackson's mind. Before he could ask, the creature collapsed, its body twitching violently on the floor. It let out a final, strained groan and then fell still. The eerie silence returned, but this time it was heavier, more oppressive. "Captain." Maya's voice broke through the tension, pulling Jackson's attention back to his crew. She was standing near the door, her face pale. "We're not alone here. I've been hearing things. Voices, movement." Jackson nodded, his mind racing. It wasn't just this creature. There were others. They were out there somewhere, in the shadows of this ghost ship. Something had changed the crew of the Elysium, twisted them into something unrecognizable. "Maya, keep your distance," Jackson ordered, his voice calm but urgent. "We don't know what happened to them, but we can't risk getting too close. We need to find out what's going on here." They began moving quickly, retracing their steps to the ship's control room. The atmosphere felt heavier with every step they took. There was a sense of wrongness in the air, something that had been waiting for them. Jackson's thoughts kept returning to one question: what happened to the crew? They arrived at the main control room, where they found more disturbing evidence. The walls were covered in strange symbols, alien markings, symbols that didn't belong to any known species. Some of the crew members had been scribbling on the walls, but the markings were different. They were changing, shifting in front of their eyes. "This is bad," Maya whispered. "This isn't just a ship, it's a prison." Jackson's eyes narrowed. A prison, or something worse. Whatever had happened to the Elysium and its crew, it wasn't over yet. The deeper they explored the Elysium, the more unsettling the ship became. Every corner seemed to hide something new, something wrong. The crew members, who had once been the pride of humanity, were no longer recognizable. They were twisted, altered beyond human understanding, their features marked by strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. It was clear now, whatever had happened to the Elysium, it had taken its toll on the crew in ways that were far beyond anything Jackson had ever imagined. What happened to them? Maya whispered, her voice shaky as she moved cautiously through the ship's narrow halls. Her hand gripped her weapon, but even that didn't seem enough to make her feel safe anymore. Jackson shook his head. I don't know, but we're getting closer to the truth. We need to find the source of whatever caused this. They came to a large chamber, hidden deep within the Elysium's heart. Inside, they found something that made Jackson's blood run cold. A massive alien artifact. It was large and pulsing, its surface covered in the same strange symbols that were etched into the walls and the crew's bodies. The air around it hummed with power, and the closer they got, the more the temperature seemed to rise. Jackson could feel it. The artifact was alive, and whatever it was dangerous. What is this? Maya breathed, her eyes wide with fear. What have we found? Jackson didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the artifact, and his mind raced. He had studied alien technology before, but this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It wasn't just a piece of technology. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. This, Jackson said slowly, is what happened to the Elysium. He stepped closer to the artifact, and as he did, a strange voice echoed in his mind, as if the artifact itself was speaking to him. The voice was deep, ancient, and filled with a terrible power. You are the ones who have come to claim what is mine. Jackson stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The voice wasn't coming from the artifact physically. It was a mental connection, something he could feel deep inside his own mind. What the hell was that? Maya demanded, her eyes darting around the room. She was clearly shaken, but Jackson didn't have time to explain. The answer was clear. The artifact was far more than a simple piece of technology. It was alive, and it had been manipulating the Elysium and its crew all along. The pieces were falling into place. The Elysium hadn't just disappeared. It had been drawn to this place, this artifact. And now it was clear what had happened to the crew. The artifact had consumed them, changed them, and given them unimaginable power. But at a cost. The crew was no longer human. They were something else, something terrifying. Jackson turned to Maya, his expression hardening. We need to destroy it. If we don't, this thing will continue to take everything, starting with us. Maya nodded, but her eyes were filled with fear. She had no idea how they were going to destroy something so powerful. But Jackson was certain of one thing. They had no other choice. The Elysium's dark heart pulsed with an energy that seemed to wrap around Jackson's mind, trying to invade his thoughts. The artifact, now fully revealed, loomed before them like a twisted god. Jackson could feel its power pressing against him, tempting him, pulling at the edges of his will. But he couldn't let it take control. Not now. Not when they were so close to ending this nightmare. We need to act fast, Jackson said, his voice steady, though inside, his mind was racing. We can't afford to waste time. Maya nodded, her face pale, but her determination clear. What's the plan? Jackson's eyes flicked back to the artifact, then to the ship's control room. The Elysium was like a giant, breathing creature, its systems alive with energy that wasn't supposed to be there. The crew, if they could still be called that, had been infected by the artifact. They were no longer just men and women. They were its slaves. The longer they waited, the more they would be drawn into the artifact's influence. The ship would become a trap, and they'd never escape. We need to shut down the ship's core systems, Jackson said, his voice firm. If we cut off the power, it should weaken the artifact. At least long enough for us to destroy it. We'll need to split up, Maya suggested, her eyes scanning the room. You and I can handle the core. The rest of the crew should stay here and keep an eye on the artifact. We can't let anything else get close to it. Jackson agreed. Let's move quickly. Stay sharp. We don't know what the Elysium is capable of now. The crew moved into action. Jackson and Maya sprinted down the dark, winding halls of the ship toward the central power core. Their footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, but the ship's eerie silence made the sounds feel louder, almost unnatural. As they moved, Jackson kept his mind focused on the task ahead. They had to stop the artifact before it grew too strong. The crew back on the bridge could only hold off the mutated crew members for so long. They reached the central core, a massive chamber filled with glowing conduits and twisting cables. The air was thick with an unsettling hum, like the entire room was alive. The artifact's power had spread throughout the ship, and it had taken root in everything. The core was no longer just a power source. It was feeding the artifact, keeping it alive and growing stronger by the second. Maya scanned the control panel, her fingers flying across the keys. "There's no easy way to shut this down," she said, her voice tight. "We'll have to overload the system." Jackson's gaze hardened. "Do it. We don't have a choice." With a deep breath, Maya started the process. Sparks flew from the console as she worked, and Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The power core was a massive, delicate system, and tampering with it could destroy the entire ship. But that was the risk they had to take. The ship suddenly shook violently, and Jackson gripped the nearest console to steady himself. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow too quick to follow, darting between the shadows of the chamber. "They're coming," Jackson muttered, as he quickly turned to Maya. "Hurry." Maya's hands moved faster, her breath shallow. Almost there. With one final press of a button, the lights flickered, and the hum of the Elysium's power dimmed. The ship shuddered again, and then everything went dark. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, from the depths of the ship, a low growl echoed through the halls. The power was gone, but so was their chance for escape. The Elysium's lights flickered, casting strange shadows in the dark halls as Jackson and Maya moved swiftly back toward the control room. The power was down, but the ship wasn't done yet. The low growl echoed through the corridors again, this time closer, sending a shiver down Jackson's spine. They were being hunted. "We need to hurry," Maya whispered, her voice tight with fear. "If the ship's systems are down, the crew, what's left of them, won't be able to track us." Jackson nodded, but his heart was pounding in his chest. They had done what they could to weaken the artifact, but the true battle was just beginning. The ship was still alive, and the corrupted crew wasn't going to let them escape. They were no longer just the Elysium's crew. They were the artifact's soldiers, and they wouldn't stop until Jackson and his team were eliminated. As they approached the control room, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. But when they turned, there was no one there, only the empty, abandoned halls of the ship. The silence was deafening, and Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Then it happened. A figure stepped out of the shadows, one of the crew. It was Lieutenant Carter, but his eyes were glowing with that same unnatural light Jackson had seen in the others. His face was twisted, his once friendly expression replaced by something dark, something monstrous. "Carter," Jackson asked, his voice shaking. "Is that you?" The lieutenant didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his weapon, the blaster in his hand aimed directly at Jackson. "You should not have come here," he said, his voice cold and empty, as though it wasn't really him speaking. "You are not meant to interfere." "Carter, stop," Maya shouted, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We're trying to help. You need to fight it. Whatever this thing is, it's not you." The lieutenant's glowing eyes narrowed. "Help," he laughed bitterly. "There is no help. Only the artifact. Only the power." Before Jackson or Maya could react, Carter lunged at them, his movements swift and unnatural. Jackson barely had time to raise his blaster before Carter knocked it out of his hand, sending it skidding across the floor. A struggle broke out. Maya fired a warning shot, but Carter was faster, dodging the blast with ease. "We can't reason with him," Jackson muttered under his breath. He had no choice. With a surge of adrenaline, he tackled Carter to the ground, pinning him beneath his weight. But it was no use. The lieutenant's strength was far greater than anything Jackson had expected. Suddenly, the ship shook violently, knocking both of them off balance. Jackson's mind raced. The Elysium was falling apart. The artifact was taking full control now. "Maya, we have to go," Jackson shouted. "Now." But before they could escape, another voice joined the chaos. This time, it was one of the ship's officers, transformed like Carter. "You won't leave," she hissed, her eyes glowing with the same eerie light. "None of you will." Jackson's eyes darted around the room, calculating their options. They couldn't fight them all. Not like this. The ship was collapsing, and they had no time to waste. In that moment, something snapped inside Jackson. He wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting to save everything they had ever known. He shoved Carter aside and grabbed a control panel, flipping switches, trying desperately to activate the emergency evacuation protocol. He knew it was risky, but they didn't have a choice. With a loud hiss, the ship's escape pods began to power up. But there was no time to be careful. The Elysium was already shaking apart, and the ceiling above them started to crack. Jackson made a decision. "Maya, go, get to the pod. I'll hold them off." "What?" Maya's voice was filled with disbelief. "No, Jackson, I'm not leaving you." "There's no time," Jackson yelled. "Just go. I'll be right behind you." With one last look, Maya ran for the pod, leaving Jackson standing alone to face the chaos. He could hear the mutated crew closing in. He knew he might not make it out, but he couldn't let the Elysium win. Not like this. The Elysium trembled as if it were alive, its once pristine hull now cracking under the pressure of its own collapse. Jackson stood alone in the chaos, his heart pounding. The ship's systems were failing, the artifact's influence spreading like wildfire. The emergency evacuation pods had been activated, but the mutating crew was closing in fast. Time was running out. He didn't know how much longer he could hold them off, but he had no choice. He couldn't let the Elysium or the artifact escape to spread its curse. Not after everything they had been through. He could hear the echoes of footsteps, fast and determined, growing louder as they neared. Jackson took a deep breath and raised his blaster, eyes scanning the dark, flickering corridor. The glow of the ship's emergency lights cast long, unsettling shadows, and he could feel the oppressive weight of the ship around him. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with tension. He had only one chance. He had to make it count. His grip tightened on his weapon, his mind racing. Every sound was magnified, every breath loud in his ears. The Elysium wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a monster, and the crew that had once called it home were its twisted soldiers, the artifact's thralls. But Jackson wasn't about to let that happen to humanity. Not if he could stop it. The first of the corrupted crew appeared, a tall, hulking figure, its face barely recognizable. The glowing eyes stared through him like a predator hunting its prey. The creature opened its mouth, a deep guttural growl slipping through its teeth. Jackson didn't hesitate. He fired, hitting the creature square in the chest. It staggered back but didn't fall. The shot hadn't been enough to stop it, but it gave Jackson the time he needed to move. More shadows appeared from the darkness. They were coming for him, and there was no place to run. The escape pods were too far away, and the only way out now was through. Jackson had learned long ago that in moments like these, when everything seemed impossible, the only choice was to fight. He fired again, taking down another one of the corrupted crew. But for every one he took down, two more took its place. They kept coming, relentless and driven by the artifact's will. Then, just as his hope began to fade, he heard the familiar sound of the escape pods activating. Maya's voice crackled through his comms, desperate but clear. "Jackson, the pod's ready. You need to move." Jackson's heart lurched. He had promised her he would follow, but now, in the midst of battle, he wasn't sure if he could make it. He glanced over his shoulder at the escape pod. its light shining in the distance like a beacon of hope. He could hear the footsteps of the corrupted crew closing in, and the pressure of the ship's collapse was growing unbearable. The Elysium was dying, but so were the things on it. Jackson knew he didn't have much time left. He took one last breath and sprinted toward the pod, firing as he went. The corrupted crew chased after him, but Jackson moved like a man possessed, his every step driven by survival. The final stretch felt like an eternity, but when he reached the pod, he didn't look back. He slammed his hand on the control panel, activating the door, and collapsed inside. The pod shot away from the Elysium just as the ship's systems failed completely, the artifact's power extinguished in a burst of energy. Through the small window of the pod, Jackson watched the Elysium begin to disintegrate, consumed by its own destruction. As the pod hurtled away from the wreckage, Jackson let out a long, shaky breath. It was over. But there would be no forgetting what had happened. The Elysium had returned with vengeance, but humanity had survived. For now, the Elysium was gone. The vast, monstrous ship had shattered in a brilliant explosion, sending debris scattering through the empty void of space. Jackson stared out of the escape pod's small window, watching the fragments of the ship break apart, each piece disappearing into the blackness. It had once been a symbol of humanity's ambition, a vessel that carried their dreams into the unknown. Now it was just another wreck, lost to time and to the power of the artifact. Inside the pod, Jackson's breath was heavy. His body ached from the strain of everything that had happened. His heart raced, but not from the fear of death anymore. No, that had passed. Now, it was something else. Relief. He had survived, but the cost had been high. So many had fallen. He glanced over at Maya, who sat silently beside him, her eyes distant. "We did it," Maya said quietly, her voice broken but steady. "It's over." Jackson didn't reply right away. What was there to say? They had destroyed the artifact, stopped the Elysium from becoming something worse, but the battle had left scars, scars that would never fully heal. He knew that, no matter how much they tried to move on, the memory of what had happened would stay with them forever. "I don't know if we'll ever understand what really happened there," Jackson said, his voice low. "But we stopped it. That's all we could do." Maya nodded, but Jackson could see the weight of the events in her eyes. The ship had been more than just a ship. It had been a doorway to something dangerous, something beyond their understanding. And now, even though it was gone, they couldn't escape the feeling that something larger was at play, something that wasn't finished with them yet. The rest of the crew was silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. The battle had been long, brutal, and impossible. Jackson knew that, no matter how far they traveled from the Elysium's wreckage, the memory of it would follow them. The crew they had lost, the twisted changes they had witnessed, these things didn't just vanish. But they had survived. And that, Jackson knew, was a testament to human resilience. The comm system buzzed, pulling Jackson from his thoughts. A voice crackled through the static. "Captain Harris, this is the Federation Command. We've received your distress signal. Help is on the way. Please stand by." Jackson closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the sound of the voice to settle in. It was strange, hearing the calm, formal tone of the Federation after everything they had been through. The calm before the storm. They had faced something unimaginable, but they had done what they had to do to survive. "Understood, Federation Command," Jackson replied, his voice steady. He glanced at Maya, and she met his eyes, both of them silently agreeing on one thing. The battle might have ended, but their story wasn't over. There was still so much more to learn, so much more to discover. The galaxy was vast, and they had only just begun to scratch the surface. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The escape pod drifted through the stars, carrying the survivors of the Elysium. They had survived the impossible, and they would carry the legacy of the lost ship, and the lessons it taught them, into the future. The stars stretched out in every direction, a sea of cold, distant lights. The escape pod drifted silently through the emptiness of space, its occupants still recovering from the horror they had witnessed. Jackson sat quietly, his hands resting on his lap, staring out of the small window. It had been hours since they left the Elysium behind, but the memories of the ship, of the crew, and of the artifact still haunted him. The ship was gone, but its influence lingered in the depths of his mind. Maya was the first to break the silence. She sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think it's over?" she asked, her voice soft. "I mean, for good." Jackson didn't answer right away. He knew what she meant. The Elysium had been a nightmare, yes, but it had also been a warning. A glimpse into something far larger than they had ever imagined. The artifact had been destroyed, but that didn't mean the danger was over. The galaxy was full of mysteries, of threats that humanity hadn't yet encountered. "I don't know," Jackson replied honestly. "The Elysium was just one ship. There could be others out there, other places like that. We can't let our guard down. Not yet." Maya nodded, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. "But we stopped it. The crew, the artifact. It's gone. We made sure it doesn't hurt anyone else." Jackson smiled faintly. "Yeah, we did. But we have to remember. Every victory is just one step in a much longer journey. The Elysium story isn't the last one we'll hear." He turned to look at her, his gaze steady. "And the way forward is unknown. But we've got each other, and that's all that matters right now." Maya's eyes softened, and for a moment, the weight of the situation lifted. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about learning, growing, and moving forward. They had seen the worst of what the universe had to offer, but they were still standing. They were still alive. Suddenly, the comm system crackled to life again. "Captain Harris, this is Federation Command. We have your location and are sending a retrieval ship. You should be safe soon. Congratulations on your survival." Jackson let out a long breath. Safe. It felt surreal to hear those words. After everything they had been through, the fight, the chaos, the unknown, it was hard to believe that they were finally making it out of the nightmare alive. "Thank you, Federation Command," Jackson said, his voice steady but filled with relief. "We're awaiting your arrival." He turned to Maya again, his expression thoughtful. "It's not over, but we've made it this far. We've earned the right to hope." The Starfinder crew had faced unimaginable odds and had come out victorious. It wasn't just about the fight or the danger. It was about human spirit. They had refused to let the darkness consume them. And in doing so, they had discovered something greater than they ever imagined. The galaxy was vast and filled with danger, but it was also full of opportunity and wonder. As the pod continued to drift toward Federation Command's rescue ship, Jackson allowed himself a small moment of peace. They had survived the impossible. And now, the real journey, one of discovery and understanding, was about to begin.